I'm Don Gayton, and this is a piece called The Beauty of Forced Reassembly. Years ago, I started this tiny vineyard in our suburban backyard just beyond the patio. I was fortunate to have my friend George, a grape grower and a winemaker, as a mentor. He provided me with cuttings from his vineyard to get me started. Making halting steps, I soon discovered how complex growing grapes and making wine can be. I found that home winemakers tend to be humble since they must know a stunning range of cultural practices, grape varieties, yeast varieties, and vinting techniques. They must also be able to convert every new problem into an intriguing challenge. Otherwise, it's just much easier to go to the liquor store. Over the years, I've faced my share of vineyard problems, including a nasty powdery mildew attack. But my little cottage industry carried on, yielding a few cases of drinkable red wine every year. Growing grapes and making wine is the ultimate geezer enterprise, since there's always some little thing that needs to be done, like tying up a rogue cane that is broken off from its trellis, or racking last year's vintage, or fixing an irrigation leak. But this trivia was replaced by major gravitas when we decided to build a carriage house on our suburban lot, which meant that I had to move more than half of the vines. Fortunately, it was late winter when the carriage house decision was made, giving me time to fret and research and plan before I had to face the actual challenge. Big questions loom. Would my vines survive the transplanting? What would the root system of an established grapevine look like? How deep, how wide would the roots extend? How much root mass must I capture for those vines to survive? Digging into the literature, my most typical response in situations, I found the work of Cato the Elder, written 2,200 years ago. Besides being a conservative Roman senator, historian, and obsessive moralizer, he was the one that coined the phrase, "Patience is a virtue." Cato was also a farmer. His very specific instructions for transplanting wine grapes were as follows, and I quote, "Dig them up carefully, roots and all, with as much of their own soil as possible, and tie them up so you can transport them. Have them carried in a box or a basket. Be careful not to dig them up or transport them when the wind is blowing or when it is raining, for this is especially to be avoided. When you place them in the trench, bed them in topsoil, spread dirt over them to the ends of the roots, trample it thoroughly, and pack with rammers and bars as firmly as possible. This is the most important thing." Pretty good advice, I thought. But then looking into more contemporary research literature on grapevine rooting patterns, I discovered that roots typically radiate outward and downward at between 10 and 150 centimeters below the soil surface, and typically there are a few thick lateral roots interspersed amongst a large array of tiny feeder roots. Now, in the stony, unforgiving soil of my yard, I knew I would be lucky to get a root ball that was even 50 centimeters deep, let alone 150. But my friend George reminded me that in spite of all of the highbrow esoterica we ascribe to wine, grapes themselves are tough and almost weedy plants. George was also fond of saying, "Humans have been making wine for 3,000 years. How hard can it be?" My scientific and emotional preparations finally complete, and armed with a sharp shovel known as a drain snake, I started my first vine extractions. As the shovel went down, I could hear it slice through the thumb-thick laterals, a truly cringe-worthy sound. I thought this must be what the surgeon feels while cutting through a tendon, wincing, but at the same time knowing it is in the best interest of the patient. But alas, perhaps I was anthropomorphizing too much. The 36 vines had to go somewhere, and there were only 4 remaining spaces in our suburban lot. One was a backyard which suffers from the lumpy lawn syndrome, where we played a sport we call off-road bocce. The second was an area of random shrubs and small trees. The third was a garden plot with tomatoes and cannabis. The fourth was a native plant garden. Emotionally attached to all of these spaces, I was not prepared to sacrifice any of them. So there was no alternative but to integrate the new vineyard right into their midst. So I laid out the vine rows, snaking them in between established ginkgos and flowering almonds and peaches and antelope brush and Kentucky bluegrass and Maui Wowie. Unprecedented arrangements previously unknown to either landscaping or to viticulture. Plant pairings I never would have conceived of until I was forced to. Now, vine rows are typically spaced about 2 meters apart. That's the optimum trade-off between sun penetration, interplant competition, and yield per hectare. As I transplanted, I stuck fairly close to this measure, except for making one very wide row to preserve the full length of our off-road bocce court. As I started to dig the holes for the transplants, occurred to me that I was not the first to integrate grapevines with gardens and landscaping. The Italians and the Greeks have been doing it for centuries, and they've also included architecture in that mix as well. These folks were not forced to do so, as I was. They did it willingly, and they do it with great elegance. So I took heart. Now the word garden, both the noun and the verb, is a delightfully ambiguous term. Historically, it has aristocratic overtones. Picture men in wigs and ladies in formal dresses passing idle afternoons amongst the manicured shrubbery, sipping from Delft teacups and lamenting the difficulty of finding good servants. At the other extreme are the community gardens of today, where contemporary landless urban peasants are able to get their hands dirty and produce a few vegetables. Such a community garden exists and thrives in Vancouver's East Hastings Street, probably the most troubled neighborhood in all of Canada. The lawn has a similar dichotomy. Historically, it represented privilege, a public statement that I, owner of said lawn, am so affluent I can put this productive land to purely ornamental use rather than growing sheep or cabbages on it. On the other hand, the modern lawn represents a democratic departure from the traditional walled estate that is hidden from public view. Open to the street, the contemporary lawn invites neighborliness and casual human encounter. So how should we separate the term gardening from the term landscaping? Answer, we shouldn't. We should embrace them as two parts of an ecocultural whole. And I hope nobody minds if I slip the term backyard viticulture in between gardening and landscaping. I could call it grapescaping. My grape transplants did survive, likely due to a cool, wet spring rather than from all of my research and performance anxiety. Our previously compartmentalized yard is now history, and now I contend with overlapping conceptual ambiguities of landscaping, ornamental gardening, food gardening, native plant culture, turf grass management, cannabis production, and viticulture. As I contemplate the results from our patio, I see positive results from this forced reassembly. I can now think outside of the rigid boxes of landscaping, grape growing, and gardening.